We're going to practice a strategy for when you have to read a passage on the computer screen, but you want to show all your thinking and your work on scrap paper. This is exactly what you're going to have available to you on the EOG. So as we look through these slides, you're going to notice a dotted line. If something is above the dotted line, then it represents the computer screen. So that's going to be the text and the question. So do not write on this because it's actually the computer screen. When you get the passage, do not write on that. You're going to show all your work on scrap paper. If it's below the line, then that's going to signify the blank paper, just like you have on the EOG. With the paper you have in front of you, I want you to fold it in half, hot dog style, and then fold that in half, hamburger style, and then open it back up so that you see 4 boxes, just like you see on my screen here. You don't need to write what I'm about to talk about. I just want to explain what's going to go in each box. Upper left-hand corner, we're going to use boxes and bullets to write down the main idea of our text, and then 3 bullets, one for the beginning, middle, and end. We do that while we're reading. On the right-hand side, if we notice figurative language, or if as we're reading something sticks out to us as possibly important, we can jot it over here on the right. That's really an optional space. Below the line in the center, on the left-hand side, we're going to consider each question and write down key language arts words and what they mean. So for example, if we see simile in the question, we're going to write down simile, like or as. If we see theme in the question, we're going to write down theme, life lesson. Then on the right-hand side, we're going to write down our answer plus our evidence. We're not going to look at the answer choices until we've carefully considered the question and even covered up the choices so they're not distracting us. So I'm going to start with a passage called I've Got Fire by Gary Paulsen. This was on New York's EOG. So let's start by reading what is in the box. If I pause, you go ahead and fill in the next word. In Gary Paulsen's book, Hatchet, a 13-year-old boy named crash lands a plane in a forest in the Canadian mountains. In this excerpt means piece, Brian tries to make a fire with a rock and thin shreds of bark. A hatchet, by the way, is a small axe. Paragraph 1. What makes fire? He thought back to school, to all those science classes. Had he ever learned what made a fire? Did a teacher ever stand up there and say, "This is what makes a fire"? He shook his head, tried to focus his thoughts. What did it take? You have to have fuel, he thought, and he had that. The bark was fuel, oxygen. There had to be air. He needed to add air. He had to fan on it, blow on it. He made the nest ready, held the hatchet backwards, tensed, and struck 4 quick sparks came down, and he leaned forward as fast as he could and blew. I'm going to stop for a second because I feel like we've read about the beginning of this text, about a third of this text, or the beginning. So in my upper left-hand corner of my paper, I'm going to start off by drawing a box, and we're going to save that until the end because our main idea we won't know until we've read this entire text. So we're going to start off under the box by creating our first bullet. So go ahead and draw that bullet, and then you're going to write as I write. So I'm thinking, what did I just read in the beginning of this story? I know in the beginning of a story, it's really important to think about the main character, where the story takes place, and then lastly, what is happening. So I'm going to write down Brian uses a hatchet, and then in parentheses, I'm just going to write axe to remind myself what that is. Bark and air, because I feel like he kept mentioning air and oxygen again and again, and he talked about fanning the fire and blowing on it, so that seemed really important to try and make fire in the woods. Now this first bullet is kind of long because I really wanted to establish the main character and the setting and talk about what was going on. Our second 2 bullets, I'm going to keep them pretty short, and I'm not even going to use complete sentences because I want to keep this part pretty quick Since nobody's grading my boxes and bullets, it's really just for me to try to better understand the passage. Okay, let's get back to the text. Too hard. Because remember, he's blowing, so this means that he blew too hard. There was a bright, almost intense, then it was gone. He had blown it out. Another set of strikes, more sparks. He leaned and blew, but gently this time, holding back and aiming the stream of air from his mouth to hit the brightest. 5 or 6 sparks had fallen in a tight mass of bark hair, and Brian centered his efforts there. The sparks grew with his gentle. The red glow moved from the sparks themselves into the bark, moved and grew and became worms, glowing red worms that crawled up the bark hairs and caught other threads of bark and grew until there was a pocket of red as big as a quarter, a glowing red coal of heat. I'm going to pause and just consider the illustration. So I notice that there's a boy, Brian, he's holding the small axe or the hatchet, and then he's gathered many small branches that look kind of like a nest, and it looks like he's hitting the hatchet against a rock to try to make a spark. And when he ran out of breath and paused to inhale, the red ball suddenly burst into flame. Fire, he yelled. I've got fire. I've got it. I've got it. I've got it. I'm going to pause for a second because I feel like this is the part that we've sort of been waiting for. In the beginning, we wanted him to make fire. Now he has fire. So I'm going to go back to my boxes and bullets, and I'm going to make this my second bullet to summarize the middle of the text. So I'm thinking about what we just read, and I remember at first that he failed. So I'm going to just say fails because he blew the fire out, then succeeds by blowing gently. And again, you're just making sure that your paper looks like my paper right now. We're going to leave space for one more bullet that's going to summarize the end of the text. And then we're going to think about what is the main idea. Okay, we stopped on the third paragraph, the third section. Let's pick it back up together. But the flames were thick and oily and burning, consuming the ball of bark as fast as if it were gasoline. He had to feed the flames, keep them going. Working as fast as he could, he carefully placed the dried grass and wood pieces he had tried at first on top of the bark and was gratified to see them take. But they would go fast. He needed more and more. He could not let the flames go out. He ran from the shelter to the pines and started breaking off the low, dead, small limbs. These he threw in went back for more, threw those in, and squatted to break and feed the hungry flames. When the small wood was going well, he went out and found larger wood and did not relax until that was. Then he leaned back against the wood brace of his door opening and smiled. I have a friend, he thought. Friend. I don't see any people around. So I'm thinking when he says, I have a friend, he's actually referring to the fire as if it were a friend. I have a friend, he thought. I have a friend now, a hungry friend, but a good one. I have a friend named Fire. Hello, Fire. The curve of the rock back made an almost perfect drawing flue. Go to the right. Flue, a passage through which smoke can escape. So the curve of the rock back made an almost perfect drawing flue that carried the smoke up through the cracks of the roof that held the. If he kept the fire small, it would be perfect and would keep anything like the porcupine from coming through the door again. A friend and a guard, he thought. So much from a friend and a guard from a tiny spark. Okay, so that's the end of the text. So we're going to go back to our boxes and bullets. And we're going to think about what happened at the end after he started the fire. After he succeeded, which was our second bullet, I'm remembering that he had to feed the fire. And what he fed it was bits of larger and larger pieces of wood. So I'm going to say here, puts larger and larger wood to keep it going. And it also seemed important to me at the end that he calls the fire a friend, meaning that it comforts him, and he calls it a guard, meaning that it protects him. So I'm going to say calls fire friend and guard. Now, we want to think about this passage as a whole, and we want to think about all of the three parts of our bullets, the beginning, middle, and end, and try to summarize this passage in one strong main idea sentence. And that's what goes in the box. So I'm just going to say here, Brian makes a fire to survive in the woods. When you're making your box, it's especially helpful to look back at the title, because the title is going to give you a lot of clues about the main idea. And the title of this text was I've got fire with an exclamation point. So I definitely want to make sure to include fire and notice that fire is in my box. It's part of my main idea. Okay, let's do the tough part now. As we go to the questions, we want to practice covering up the choices. So I find it really helpful if you have an extra piece of paper, because you'll have multiple pieces of scrap paper, to cover up the answer choices, or you can simply practice not looking at them and just focus on the question. So we're going to look at question 6. It says, what is the passage mainly about? All I'm thinking about is, what exactly is this question asking me to do? What are the most important words in the question? I'm noticing that this question says mainly about, which makes me think it is a main idea question. So I'm going to jump down here to my bottom 2 boxes on my foldable, and I'm going to write here question 6, and then the words mainly about. And I know that that means this is a main idea question, so I'm going to write MI, and I'm going to remind myself to look at the title. Then I'm going to go on the right-hand side of my foldable, and I'm going to try to think about the answer and how I know. So before I even look at the choices, I know that my answer has to include making a fire. So I'm just going to write the word fire. Then we want to look up to our answer choices and see which best matches that. So it says A boy's memories of his science class. I know that's not it. It has nothing to do with fire. A boy's successful attempt to start a fire. That includes fire, and it says that he was successful, which is true. So B is looking okay. C, the things that are needed to build a fire. And that seems kind of important too, so I'm going to leave that one. D, the best way to build a shelter in the woods. That doesn't include fire. So really, we're picking between B and C. So look back at B, a boy's successful attempt to start a fire, or C, the things that are needed to build a fire. In my main idea, I included the word Brian. The problem with C, the things that are needed to build a fire, is that it doesn't include Brian, whereas B mentions a boy. So that includes 2 parts, fire and Brian. So let's jump down to our foldable part. I think the answer here is B, and then I want to say why. So I'm going to say B has Brian and fire, which those were 2 really important parts. Notice that my evidence in this case is in my own words. Your evidence can be in your own words, or it can be a quote from the story. Let's look at question 7. Again, we're going to focus on just the question first. Where does this passage take place? This question is a setting question. So down in my foldable, below number 6, I'm going to write 7, setting. Then I'm actually going to think to myself, what is the setting of this text? And I know that this was in the woods. The reason that I know it's in the woods, I'm going to put over here as my evidence. I'm going to use quotes because I'm using author's words, not my own. Look in the box directly below the title. It says here, In Gary Paulson's book Hatchet, a 13-year-old boy named Brian crashed